Hello and welcome to this Farm Advisory Service webinar. My name is Seamus Murphy and I'm the host this evening. This webinar is the last of the series that we've done on COP26, and the focus is on adaptation and how we can adapt to climate change and everything that kind of comes with it in terms of all of the different things that we looked at over the last few weeks with policy, how we actually get mitigation happening on the ground on farms, all of these different things that are going to become a key part of Scotland meeting its climate change objectives and targets going forward as we move towards net zero in 2045. Now, this week, it's a bit different. In the last few webinars of this series, we had presenters and it was kind of a presentation and then a Q&A. This webinar, we're looking to get just a panel session. So I've got panelists here with me. I'm going to try and take questions from you guys, and then we'll try and get a bit of a discussion going. So it's a bit different, and I hope you'll help me with this and try and make it a success. So key to that is questions. So getting your questions in, getting any chat, any comments, anything like that, just getting it in early. We've got a great panel here, and hopefully they'll be able to answer any questions that you might have. So anything, I know I see on the list of attendees here, we've got a lot of revisits, people who've been at other webinars in the series. And if you have any kind of burning questions from those, I'm sure the folk that we have in the panel tonight will be able to help you with that. So please, please, please get your questions across as soon as possible when you start thinking about this kind of stuff and how we can adapt. So, well, first of all, why we need to adapt. And the main reason why we need to adapt is because climate change isn't something that's going to happen in the future. Climate change is something that is happening. The most recent IPCC report that came out just over a month ago now, I think, that kind of suggested that we're probably gone beyond limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So the Paris Agreement aimed to limit warming to 2 degrees, but aiming towards that 1.5 degrees. So global warming to 1.5 degrees. The IPCC now think that target is gone. That it's likely that we will, no matter what, hit that 1.5 degrees warming. So that means that our climate is going to change. How drastic that is what we can control. And that's what we were talking about in the previous webinars when we talked about mitigation and what we could do to sequester more carbon and limit the kind of severity and the extent of the consequences of the warming on the planet and on our own businesses throughout Scotland. So that's where we are. But we want to look at, okay, climate change is happening. What can we do? And what other impacts of the kind of climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis could have an impact on the way we farm in Scotland today. So to help with that, I have got a panel for the night. And in no particular order, we have Alex Berry, who is an agricultural consultant in the AIR office. Alex will introduce himself in a minute, but some of you will be familiar with him. He was helping out on a couple of the earlier webinars, and Alex has a keen interest in biodiversity and climate change and that kind of side of things. So get your questions into Alex, and he'll be able to, alongside the other panelists, we'll be able to deal with anything you throw at us. Then next up, I've got Julian Bell. And Julian is an agricultural economist, and Julian was heavily involved in development and the continuation of AgriCalc, the farm carbon calculator. So likewise, get your questions into Julian. We've got Ian Boyd, who's an environmental consultant in the environment team with SAC Consulting. And Ian helped to develop an adaptation booklet for farmers to build resilience around the physical impacts of climate change. And then we have Sasha Grierson, I have Sasha's title down here as food consultant, but I think there could be any number of titles for Sasha. And so please get your questions in early for these folk, and we'll try and get a good panel session going. It's essentially going to be a bit of a Q&A for starting kind of at about 8:30. So now at this point, I want to just hand over to Alex first and foremost, and he's just going to give you a kind of a 5-minute introduction. We're going to try and take this order here on the screen. So once Alex is finished, Julian will take over. And whilst they're giving their introductions, please have a think about kind of some questions or comments that you'd like to make, and just get them in there, and I'll start firing them out to the panel. So Alex, if you'd like to take over.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thanks very much, Seamus, for organising the series, and thanks for having me back. It's been a really good series. I'm sure that you mentioned there were a couple of returning faces in the crowd. I was certainly one of them. Seamus, you introduced me as an agricultural consultant, and that's correct. I am an agricultural consultant. I work out of the SAC Air office. And I service, give or take, around about 150 clients in a really diverse office. One of the things that each of those clients has in common is that they are all going to have to come to grips with the threats of climate change. So regardless of what your particular specialization is within SAC consulting and other consultancies out there, we're all going to have to really get to grips with it. Seamus also mentioned that I have a keen interest in biodiversity conservation. So I am our internal coordinator for the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme. I take a great interest in the delivery of that scheme. Some of you might be familiar with my voice, certainly, as the host of Thrill of the Hill, which is another farm advisory service podcast series that we operate. And I've also worked with initiatives like Farming for a Better Climate on and off through the years since I've started working with SAC Consulting. Going forward, in terms of adaptation, I think there's a real treasure trove of things to discuss tonight. Obviously, what do we mean by adaptation? Are we talking about how farmers are going to adapt to the forthcoming policy that we're expecting? How are farmers going to adapt to increasing climate, the increasing temperatures on their farms and the challenges that are going to bring? So yeah, there's no end to the stuff that we can discuss here tonight. And like you, Seamus, I'm really looking forward to getting into it with the attendees and with Julian, Sasha, and Ian.
Good stuff. Thanks, Alex. Julian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Evening, everyone. Yeah, welcome, and great to be joining the discussion tonight. So look forward to all your questions and diverse views. Now, I think my background, so I've worked in sort of farm business economics, markets, and quite a few sort of business areas in farming, but I've actually spent 15 years working on carbon. Before it was clearly a relative sort of minor issue in terms of general uptake, but that's obviously rapidly grown. But I think the fact it's moving from, a nice thing to do to becoming, doing something about climate change and dealing with climate change, moving something that's been quite a nice thing to do to becoming critical to businesses' future is really where we're at the moment. We're just on that cusp where it's starting to, well, it is already, as Seamus has said, affecting agricultural businesses, all sorts of businesses, and they are businesses, whether they're farming or otherwise, have got to react and have got to take a look for the opportunities and manage the risks. So although we are talking about the climate, actually it comes back to a lot of practical business issues. So that quite neatly is sort of brings it all back, and when you start thinking about it, I mean, the world economy is basically built on capitalism. This is probably the biggest problem the world's ever faced. We don't have time to come up with another system of solving it. We're going to have to work with the tools we've got. And so the business side of it, financial incentives, and coping with the fluctuations that the changing climate and changing sort of environment or economic environment, a lot of it, the tough things that everyone's going to have to do, and the opportunities are going to revolve around business opportunities or risks. So that's just an area I'd like to just, we're moving into that, the rubber hits the road kind of situation with climate change and farm businesses.
Yeah, and COP26 will definitely ramp that up as well, I think, and it's definitely ramping up in people's minds anyway. Ian, I know you have a couple of slides, I think, to share.
I do, yeah. Don't know if that gives me bonus points or what, but yeah, I've got a couple of slides. But yeah, hi everyone. My name is Ian Boyd. I've actually been in the background of every one of these webinars over the last few weeks, so it's nice to be allowed to show my face for once, which is good. I am an environmental consultant in the environment team for SEC Consulting. I've been there for almost 7 years now. My background is in the environmental and energy sectors. Before that, we do a lot of work in the environment team for various agricultural clients and businesses and landowners on a whole range of environmental issues, and yeah, more and more climate change is becoming one of the key areas. If I can share my screen now, this works. So hopefully that's worked. You can see that okay?
Yeah, looks good.
So I just want to give a quick overview about why we're doing this tonight, why it's this theme. This is a definition here, which the UN kind of has for what adaptation is, because a phrase that's used quite a lot, but it's perhaps something you don't actually know what the full definition of it is. I think the key thing there, though, is to take away is the last bit, and it's which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities, because it is that mix of both. It's not just all about the negative. There's potential benefits and potential positives that might come out of the consequences and impacts of climate change, and we need to be aware of what those are. The whole point of this series of webinars is because of the COP conference, which is happening in Glasgow, and adaptation is one of the 4 main goals, one of the 4 main kind of aims of the conference, and it's to try and get countries, society, everyone kind of prepared and ready for climate change, and to try and mitigate any harm or negative impacts there might be. And we are seeing that already. I mean, there's no doubt the climate is changing and it is having an impact, and it is having an impact on agriculture and agricultural productivity. The latest kind of findings are suggesting that we're going to have milder, wetter winters, warmer, drier summers. You're going to have more extreme events. You're already seeing shifts in rainfall patterns, and you're seeing differences in growing seasons, changes in yield. So a mix of potentially benefits and negative impacts. There's likely to be a change in the prevalence, range, and types of pests and diseases, and things like soil and water quality is changing. You're having flooding issues. Infrastructure is having to cope with extreme events more often. And again, just to kind of build on what Julian just mentioned there, it is not just about weather. It's this mix of social impacts, environmental impact, economic and market kind of adaptations as well you have to look at. So it's not just all about changing rainfall. And there is these risks and rewards. The Environment Agency was released a week ago a pretty stark warning that we all need to adapt or die, as they put it. And the increase in flooding is one of the main risks. We've seen that across Europe and Germany, places like that. It's having a real impact on people's lives. Extreme events last year, there was really extreme heat waves that have been happening, and they're going to happen more often. And especially for agriculture, a lot of the talk is about agriculture's contribution to climate change. That's a lot of the focus is about increasing emissions, but actually agriculture is one of the sectors that's going to be most impacted from the consequences and impacts of climate change as well. So we need to really remember that and really get ready and prepared for it. And I use this example of the wine is potential opportunities for changes in varieties and types of crops. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're all suddenly start going wine and vineyards in Scotland, which would be nice, but we are seeing things like in the south of England, the Champagne region in France is starting to move further north because of climate change, and you're seeing an increase of wine and sparkling wine and stuff being grown in England. So it is having these kind of potential opportunities to see what the kind of market benefits might be and what new kind of ideas or new opportunities you can have on your farm. And then finally, just in terms of resources to help you look at adaptation measures, every farm will be different. So it's just a case of looking at what will be best for your business. And we've produced this, like Seamus said, this guide on helping you adapt. It's basically a checklist in it to go through your farm and see what is the most suitable options for your business. Like I say, a lot of it is potentially not things you would think of as adaptation. It's just common sense. It's just best practice. It's just stuff you're doing already to kind of help your be sustainable in everything you do. And you can get that on the Farming for a Better Climate webpage, which is at the bottom link there. And Adaptation Scotland is a Scottish government funded programme as well. It's got lots of practical advice, practical tips on how to help adapt to climate change. So yeah, check out those links. That's my 4 slides done.
Thanks, Ian. I think that's something as well that adaptation in terms of in agriculture and in business and all these kind of things can sometimes seem to be like the poor brother of mitigation, when mitigation kind of takes control, and then adaptation just becomes an afterthought. And I think we need to start giving them both equal kind of importance when we're thinking about what we're doing. Okay, I'll hand over to Sasha then.
Thanks very much, Seamus. Many thanks to you all for coming along tonight. I am Sasha Grierson. My current position is that I manage the Scottish Farm Business Survey, which is a survey of over 400 Scottish farms of mixed farming, of different farming types. And it's a deep dive economic and environmental survey on a mixture of Scottish farming businesses. And the data goes to the Scottish Government, and Scottish Government uses this information to try to understand the impact of policy, to help them with their policy decision making. And so my interest here is really very much in, you know, we are coming up to a period of great change, and we need to monitor that, and we need good information and good statistics. And so I feel it's very important that we have these kinds of agricultural statistics projects, to help support policy decision making, so that people aren't making decisions in a void without correct information. But in my other life, I own and used to run an organic food and farming business with my husband Hugh in rural Perthshire. We are a typically mixed farming business, and we sold direct to the customer. And I feel very strongly that, so I had these conversations with customers, with a very, very growing number of customers and a very concerned group of customers. And I do feel that a lot of adaptations that may be coming could well be customer driven, that customers will want to buy from businesses that demonstrate how they are operating in the new world, using new language. And I think it's very important that as farming businesses, it gives us an opportunity to adapt to the changes that, as Julian and others have said, that, you know, that they're coming anyway. So we can't not look at things. And I think it does give us as farming businesses on the ground the opportunity to do a kind of a sort of asset audit on our farm, and, you know, including your landscape is an asset, your stone walls are an asset, your potential for hedge planting is an asset, but that also contributes towards the biodiversity and greenhouse gas emission goals that the country has, and also provides you with new opportunities to potentially engage with customers. How that actually happens in practice will vary from business to business according to the business's own resources and their desire for what level of kind of change they want. But I do think it can present opportunities for farmers for the future.
That's great. Well, we've actually already got some questions coming in. But first off, I kind of just wanted to ask all of our attendees. We've not got a poll or anything set up, but do you consider, or would you consider adaptation when you're making changes on farms? If you do, or if you have done anything like that, if you could just write it in the chat, or you can do it anonymously or whatever. It'd just be interesting to know if adaptation to climate change is something that's considered in the day-to-day kind of farming practices. But we have a few questions coming in, but I'm just gonna ask all the panelists if they wouldn't mind answering one about kind of future risks. So you're all kind of coming at it from slightly different backgrounds, slightly different angles. You look at farming and you look at agriculture through different lenses. In terms of adaptation, so it doesn't necessarily need to be adapting to climate change, but in terms of what's coming in the future, the risk in the future, what is the most important adaptation or the biggest risk and the biggest thing that farmers will need to adapt to as we move towards net zero and 2045? So who wants to take that one up first? Don't all go at once.
I kind of. So, there's a few things. I mean, let's not beat about the bush. There are huge opportunities for farming. Okay, so it is at some point it is going to get harder and harder to keep up with the human population in terms of food. It was probably under control, but now with weather issues obviously causing fluctuations and things like that, it's going to get harder. The problem for individual business is the year-to-year variation, and whether it's the weather attacking or destroying something, or whether it's a market shooting up and then collapsing, that is and then a lot of my other previous work's been with sort of crop farmers. But what we tended to find was the best performing farms were more consistent, and they took a lot of effort to counter risks and maintain, protect yields, protect the end price. Spent a lot of time and diversifying as well. So it's thinking ahead and doing. You can start with the back of an envelope. This is my business today. Where does my income come from? What would really hurt if X, Y, or Z suffered, and do something about that. Either protect those biggest things that affect your income, or say, well, that's too much. 80% is too much of my income. I need to diversify into things that will be not so connected, because the point about the future is we just don't know what's going to happen now. But I think what we can be sure of is that more and more unexpected and more extreme things are going to happen. So it is basically doubling down on what are basically age-old strategies, and when the times are reasonably okay, is to build for the future and protect for that.
Yeah, it's all about kind of looking at, then, as you said, looking at where the highest risk is in your own setup. Like, does anyone else want to come in there? I think Alex was.
Yeah. Do you mind if I jump in here? Julian, you used the word there, and it was consistent. I think one of the big threats that I see, one of the things that I think that Scottish agriculture has to be careful of here, is that as we set targets to achieve net zero, we have to be consistent. There has to be that gradual move towards net zero. It has to be controlled. It has to be monitored. But it also has to be challenging enough that we achieve what we set out to do, and straightforward enough that farmers are going to implement those changes. One of the things I don't want to see is us having the same kind of webinar series in 5 years' time, and the wheels have totally come off the process, and we are going to have policy forced on us as opposed to, you know, consulted with us. I think we've got to be careful of that.
Yeah, I would, you know, following up from what Julian and Alec are both saying, there's a kind of new language to learn here, and I think various different groups of people are sort of at different stages along the way, and sometimes it's the change in consciousness. It's the kind of, instead of saying, oh well, we better do this, it's like, well, we can't not. And I think that you know, I think that language is out there. The presence of COP26 in Scotland has driven a huge amount of conversation about it. And I think almost sometimes the hardest changes for people to make are the changes they make in their head and the changes in the words they use each day. And actually moving that conversation along is very important. And there's something about a managed transition phase that Alec refers to. You know, the worst thing possible would be having something forced upon you, either because of the climate changing irrevocably for your business and that you haven't prepared for it, but also because there's some form of governmental decree, and it just happens. So I think it's sort of, we have to kind of get on with it, and we don't really want to be mincing our words anymore. We have to just get on with it and do it.
I think it's worth, we've all got to understand that we're not going to solve anything unless people are fed, right? You cannot solve anything unless people have got food on the table. And with the best will in the world, whatever political things happen in the future, you have to, your economic, producing food at a reasonable price and freely available to people will remain absolutely number one. You cannot solve, and this is a global thing, we cannot solve this problem if people are worrying about other things like basic and how they're going to feed themselves. So farming has really got to make that point, and that whatever policies come along, that they support productive agriculture. It's because, you know, as I say, whatever your motives are, you know, that is agriculture's job. The challenge is to keep doing that under all these pressures and obviously contribute to lowering emissions. So no one says it's going to be easy, but I think we're seeing that with energy transition at the moment. It's got to be done, like Alex said and others have said, we've got to do it carefully and not leap too far ahead and cause unexpected problems by forcing the industry into corners that it's going to struggle with. So
yeah, it's that incredibly difficult task that farmers have, isn't it, of trying to balance these different potentially conflicting areas, sometimes of affordability, plentiful supply, environmental impact. I think is why this adaptation and mitigation needs to go hand in hand, and it hasn't really done that much in the past. You know, all these very strong mitigation targets and things like that have been almost developed on their own, and now it's adaptation is trying to catch up a little bit, and people are thinking about how to deal with it. And part of the adaptation is helping to deal with these ripple effects of potential policies and outputs, and especially with COP26, who knows what they're actually going to decide or what the kind of key kind of outputs will be from it. But it's encouraging that adaptation is one of the main themes, alongside finance and various other different topics that they're wanting to, biodiversity and nature and all these sorts of things, and limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Adaptation is a key part of that. And the whole point of adaptation is to manage and minimize this risk. So hopefully there is no big surprises or big shocks. And if there is any potential opportunities, then you're in a really good place to try and take advantage of them.
I think the other thing that's, well, we're seeing that now with sort of groups of farmers supplying into different supply chains. All the nice talk about, yeah, whether it's a major manufacturer or a retailer looking to cut carbon, all that nice talk is fine, but the farmers are saying, okay, do you want us to do something? Yes, right. Well, and some of the groups of farmers don't. They're saying, right, well, what can we as a group of farmers do, and what can we offer to our buyers, and what is the cost going to be, and can we get will they pay for it? This is where the real pressure comes from. If there's a cost, who's going to pay for it? Is it the supply chain, or the government going to step in? You know, and this is where we're just moving into the stage where people are looking at the costs, they're looking at different techniques, they're looking at markets, and you know, they're starting to nut things out. And it's because that is where the true test will come. Is, yeah, okay, you want your carbon reduction. Well, how are we going to do it? Who's going to pay for it? What's the mechanism going to be? And there's no easy answer to that. But I think just to sort of end on that point, I think it's very much in the farmers' benefit to sort of start to work that out themselves as much as they can with help, but where needed, but to actually be in a stronger position so that they understand what they can do and what the cost implications might be. Yeah,
I think that's a key as well. In some of the previous webinars we had, there was talk about the efficiency improvements that will actually save money on farm are not going to be enough to achieve the targets that will be set out. And then it is a question of, well, where does the money come from to actually pay for these things that are going above and beyond just the efficiency improvements? And that's what's really needed. So that's a key question. There's also, I want to move to the questions now that have come in, because there's a good few have come in. I'll start with this one here. And I think that I'm going to ask two questions, but well, first off, I suppose, do we all agree that there is going to be forced change in production methods? And secondly, then, what do you think the time frame would be for those changes to be implemented?
Forced change.
Yeah.
That's, well, I think that I can't imagine anyone is wanting to force anybody to do anything. There will be an economic piece where you will be encouraged to do so. Potentially policy mechanisms and payments will come in that will heavily encourage you to do so. I suspect that it will take the form that people will be encouraged to enter and produce some kind of baseline information about their farm or their business on some key outcome measures like carbon footprinting, greenhouse gas emissions, and biodiversity, and that people won't be cast out from the process. Will be encouraged to come into the process, and will start from where they are with potential improvement targets set. You know, gone are the days for just being paid for showing up. I suspect that, I think that era may well be over. And I think that's probably, personally, anyway, that's maybe the right way forward if we want to actually drive change in a short time frame. You know, we're talking about net zero by 2045 and lots of interim targets over the next 10 years. And yes, I'm envisaging a transition to that happening over the next 5 to 6 years. I don't have any particular inside information. That's just what I think will happen.
Mm-hmm. And do you think then, just I'm thinking about that, do you think that if a farmer decides that they don't want to take part in these incentives or don't want to do this kind of work, the future would be very difficult for them?
Well, every business is in charge of its own destiny. You know, if you own your own business, unless somebody comes in with legal requirements to put over your land that you have to manage it in a certain way, which, you know, that's quite, we wouldn't like to see that, but every business will make their own decisions. Would it be difficult for them? It really depends on what shape their business is in, what their finances are. And I think there's an element of, Julian, I've heard you talk about this before, that farms in the UK and in Scotland, you know, everyone can drive by them and can see, the general public, you know, we're quite exposed as farmers. the general public can see us and can see what we're doing, and the general public is interested in this stuff. You know, they want to know what's going on. They want to find ways to help contribute, make their own personal contribution towards adapting their own diet, their own practice, how they live their own lives. So it's not, you know, it's up to each individual business to scrutinize their own resources and figure out the best way forward. I imagine it might be a pretty difficult climate to do that for a farming business.
I would just say, look, I mean, it's not just farming, like nobody actually knows how we're going to do this, right? So it's like the whole argument about heat pumps and things like that, you know, how are we going to heat homes without too high a cost, etc. So farming, you know, it's going to take longer for anyone to work, well, no, you know, to work this out. And the opportunity is to find a solution, and farmers, you know, can do that. You know, they're already doing that. You know, so I think there's as much, I think, and we've seen that with farmers, that there's a sort of sense, well, actually, we could get ahead of this curve if we really know what we're doing. We get on with it. We pick up the latest science. We improve our techniques. We look at new techniques. You know, we see that is really coming through. There's quite a strong sense that this is going to be a bit different. Farming has an opportunity to actually take a lead and not be a sitting sort of target for whatever policies come along. And there, if you look at the government, the government are struggling to know exactly how to do this, you know, in a viable way in all the different sectors. So, you know, although that creates sort of lack of certainty, I think it gives an opportunity for farmers a bit of time to actually come forward with positive solutions.
Mm-hmm. That kind of comes back to what Alex, you mentioned there about being quite ambitious in what we kind of put forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I worry that, you know, we're being asked what's going to change, what's going to force people to innovate, what's going to drive this change. I mean, we see it. We're seeing it right now for a lot of farmers within the industry. I mean, change is happening, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. Somebody will mention it at some point in the webinar. But whether you're looking at something like inorganic fertilizer prices right now, I mean, the markets will drive change. We have to adapt to that, and we have to come up with the most sustainable way of continuing doing what we're doing and even doing it better.
Yeah, I say it is kind of, I'm sure a lot of people will be looking at the kind of things that you're doing in your farm, Sasha, in the organic kind of world, to see where they can maybe make savings when it comes to fertilizers now, and probably going forward too, due to the kind of shock this year. I'm keen that I want to keep the questions coming, because there are a lot of questions still coming in. So I want to make sure that we try and hit as much as we can. This is quite a one I probably for yourself, Julian. When an agricultural contractor does a job on a farm, who is responsible for the emissions for the job?
That is an interesting point.
I
mean, well, depends how. I mean, you can sort of look at this two. Well, you can look at this two ways, but the farm as a business, the farm is producing, obviously, food. So it's the emissions to produce that food include, well, if you go for the life cycle approach, that will include the use of contractors to cultivate soil and things like that. So when you look at the product, that's fairly straightforward. But when you look at as a business, and it depends which, you could start to argue that, well, actually, but then the farmer, you know, depends how many tiers, scopes, etc. you look at, or scopes, or you look at, because the contractor is actually a supplier into the farmer. So ultimately, you could pick up the contractor that way. You know, but then the contractors have got suppliers like his fuel suppliers. So that is not an easy one to answer, because it very much depends on what boundaries you put around different. But I would say generally, it's the producer the product. I mean, that's the way we tend to look at it. I'm not saying that's the only way to look at it, but generally the contractor is supplying a service, an input to the product, which is then moving on down the chain to someone else. So I think that, yeah, but there are different ways to look at it.
Grant, that was a kind of a specific question. I'd say I don't think anyone else has much to say on that. There was also just a comment in the Q&A about not being able to see all the questions. That certainly shouldn't be the case. I think as far as I can check here, there might well just be, there are some questions coming in the chat. So I don't know if there's just a bit of confusion there, but you should be able to see all of the questions. I'll move on anyway to the next one, and this is how are we going to persuade many in the rural economy who haven't started moving towards these kind of more to these different methods that can be used to adapt and mitigate climate change. How can we kind of encourage and persuade these folk?
So there's I've kind of got two answers here. I think that Scottish Government needs to become better at disseminating information that's obtained through schemes. We've seen historically things like the beef efficiency scheme. I think that there's a lot of data behind there, and we need to make sure that gets out to farmers and that they can see the improvements that they've made, and that will encourage people into it. But I also think that there's a lot of farmer-led groups out there now. Farmers are being proactive, they're taking steps themselves, and we as an industry need to platform those changes and get our messages out where we can.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. It'll be interesting next year to see what the Scottish Government's climate change plan is and what the potential funding or incentives or that will be in it for agriculture, especially after COP. So I think it's always better to carrot rather than stick approach. But no, it'll be interesting to see that. I also think it's just, as we've mentioned already, a lot of these adaptation things that you want to encourage people or businesses or farmers to do, a lot of it is just good practice. A lot of it is just economic business sense at the end of the day. So I think in terms of just looking at your overall business sustainability, if you even just take climate change and that out of it, it's just a worthwhile practical thing to do, is to take a step back, to look at your business and see if there's any potential improvements you can make or ways to improve profitability or efficiencies or sustainability. It's just a good kind of common sense business approach. And a lot of farmers are doing it already.
I think that I agree with what both parties have said. I think policy change has a lot to policy incentives has a real role to play. However, with soaring fertilizer prices, if you're growing grain to feed your cattle and you're putting an input there, you may go, hang on a second, this isn't working for me. And a classic example is, right, okay, I've heard about this rotational grazing business, maybe I can make more of my grass, and I can suddenly find that I can get better productivity. Oh dear, I've got Limousin cattle, maybe I need to change my breed of cattle to kind of potentially use a more native breed that finishes or that does well on grass. And these are the kinds of subtle, no, it's not subtle change for people, but these are the kinds of practical changes that people will do in response to, I can't afford that fertilizer. There will be businesses out there who just go, I can't buy it. I can't buy it, it's too expensive, I don't have the cash flow, whatever. And then there'll be other people who go, hang on a minute, this just doesn't stack up. They'll run the numbers and they'll go, this doesn't work anymore. So those are the kinds of changes that are happening. You know, Seamus, you mentioned earlier about some practices on organic farms. The big one is clover. Clover isn't a new thing. The Romans have been using it. We're using it 2,000-3,000 years ago. So, you know, these are, maybe we'll look backwards, apply some better technology to some methods from the past and go forwards in that way. And I think there's now, when the money becomes really tight, people start having proper conversations and start making real change. That's my experience from running a business. So
I think, you know, there's no point that you cannot get away from this achieving more with your existing resources, making more of the natural ability of your land. You know, even if whatever you think about climate change, the world, there's more people coming, they're getting wealthier, they're demanding resources, you know, and the competition of resources is just going to go up. And so we've had an incredible period of incredibly cheap fuel, incredibly cheap fertilizer, feeds, everything. You know, a whole system of agriculture has been built on the fact you can ship things around the world cheaply and relatively inexhaustible supplies of energy and all the rest of it. Well, for various reasons, that whole thing is tightening down, and it is going to just cost more. You know, so again, it may well, like Sasha says, go back to some of the basic principles of farming that we've obviously practiced for thousands of years, and make more of natural and be more efficient. But we have got technology. I mean, that is obviously the key thing. There's a huge amount that farmers are already doing and can do, and that we hope to do in the future, with whether it's better genetics of animals, you know, remote sampling, remote sensing, sorry, you know, spatial sampling of soils, you know, monitoring, you know, the host of technology we've got, which can just help optimize things that were just completely impossible 5 or 10, 15 years ago. So yes, it's some of the old basic principles, but we've got a lot of new technology, new techniques that we can use to optimize them way beyond what was possible in the past. So yeah, so it's an interesting kind of hybrid we maybe could help us in the future.
That actually leads quite well, Julian, into the next question that's in the Q&A here. With the inevitable changes in production methods, can we maintain the yields, particularly to feed the growing world population? So I think you kind of half answered that, but you want to add a bit to it?
Well, I think before we get to that, it's actually worth bearing in mind and going back a wee bit. It's not, for the individual farmer, it's not actually about what your yields are. It's not actually about how much you produce or how heavy your animals are, or how many tons per hectare you get. It's whether you're making any money, right? And it might be for a lot of farms that they're not actually optimized to, you know, they're not sustainable financially. They're relying on a lot of inputs to achieve whatever yields they happen to be. And, you know, but this may not be sustainable. So what the world needs is sustainable farming that is operating at a level that can, you know, can sustain the soil and maintain the productivity of the land. And yes, we can use, you know, obviously, whether that's going to, you know, that has generally fed people up till now, and we will have to just use technology and other things to maintain. But, you know, just shoveling huge amounts of inputs into cropping and things like that is perhaps going to be questionable in the future.
Do you think though that the in terms of the growing population can, well, I suppose this is a lot bigger question maybe, but can we do that? Can we sustainably farm into the future? Can we continue in the way we are farming right now, and still maintain, and still with a rising global population that is fed?
Well, interesting. If you look at the areas under cereals has actually declined in the world, because the reason is that we've managed to grow the yields more quickly than the population. And yeah, that is a huge question. Can that be sustained? I mean, putting climate change to one side, you know, I don't think anyone thinks we're going to run out of improvements in yields. You know, technology is going to allow us to keep going. I suppose the one that's very hard to answer is whether it's rising temperatures or other issues, whether the productivity of the world's bread baskets can be maintained. But it's incredible amount of the improvements we have used, we have delivered. The farmers have delivered, and and kept everyone fed. So I think that is still, that is possible. Obviously, the more extreme climate change becomes, the more questionable that assumption will be. But I mean, at the moment, the assumption is that farmers can. But the other thing not to forget is, to do that, farmers have got to be profitable and the investment's got to go into all the technology and everything else, which means farming has got to. So actually, yes, we can probably do it, but only if farm is viable and the money is flowing into support all the research and technology that's going to need it to do it, which means we might have to start paying more for food. But I think that is ultimately how that is the main solution to that.
Julian hit on something really good there, actually, that sustainability has lots of different uses, and we talk about sustainability in terms of resilience to climate change and adaptation to climate change, but a business that isn't making money isn't sustainable and cannot be sustainable in any other any other sense. So yeah, absolutely. I think we have to receive a fair price for the products that we're making, and we can get on top of the climate issue.
One thing, just to turn this on its head a little bit, and without wanting to sound isolationist, is it really Scottish farming's job to feed the world? Potentially not. As a nation, what do we do well? Scotland, UK, whatever you want to say. But let's think about Scotland. What do we do well? What are our resources? Where's our expertise? Oh, guess what? Our national crop is grass. This is what we do really well. So perhaps we need to, we have enough rain, we have the capability, we have the breeding history, we have the knowledge history in order to do that job really, really well. And that may be, one can argue, I'm not saying this should be it, but one can argue the case that we really focus our energies on the things that work really well in this country. And potentially that's how we can make our contribution. We also have some excellent research institutes where we have the capability to drive a lot of innovation, technological innovation, but also breeding innovations that we can then potentially export to other parts of the world. And I think that's where Scotland contributes very well. But I think, I used to get asked that question every single time I'd go into a meeting and somebody would fold their arms and go, so how's organic farming going to feed the world? And it's like, well, actually, it's not my business's job to feed the world. It's my business. And coming back to Alex's point, everybody's made it. It's my business to be still here as a viable business in 20 years' time for the next generation. And that's very much driven a lot of the business decision-making that we've made. People have different drivers for doing the things that they do. And there's no denying that, the economic driver was a very significant one when we set about making changes. But I do think that in Scotland, we have good opportunities for creating, for businesses to adapt using the best information, a great tradition and background, and a great history in making the best from grass.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think it's worth noting as well, because the question was about a global population. I mean, we do focus on Scotland, rightly so, because we all live in Scotland, but I mean, there will be parts of the world where climate adaptation for them is literally life and death. They're going to be impacted an awful lot more than potentially we are in this country here. And yeah, it'll be impossible, the size of Scotland, to kind of feed the world. But I think you're right, Sasha, and focusing on what we do best and kind of exporting that as our offering to help set a good example, really, and try and solve the problem that way. In terms of, if we specifically talk about yield, just an interesting little point, which I don't know might help answer the question, is if we go back to some of the benefits potentially there might be, there is chat that cause of climate change, you might actually see the increase of things like prime agricultural land increase in parts of Scotland, because prime agricultural land isn't just about the soil, it's also about the climate. So if you're making certain improvements in climate and rainfall in some parts, you can actually perhaps increase the class 2.1, class 2 or 3.1 land. And likewise, apparently there's been like a increase in potato yields since the 1960s in East Coast of Scotland, and part of that is because of changing climate. So there is potentially yield benefits and advantages there if we try and find them and look for them. There is also, if there's more extreme events, more droughts, more heavy rainfall, that could have the opposite effect. So it's not an easy, clear picture. It's a bit of a muddle at times, but it's trying to look for those benefits and do the things that we do best, and yeah, draw on those examples to export them worldwide.
It's, but just on the, if you think of the UK is 1% of world agricultural output. Scotland is 0.1%.
Yeah.
So the world's 99% of. But it's interesting. But we are finding that because we've got obviously the UK retailers are actually pretty far ahead compared to a lot of others around the world. So they're obviously asking farmers here to start looking at and work on the carbon footprint. But they're actually asking farmers elsewhere around the world, because a huge amount, we also import a huge amount, and we do a lot of work with fruit and fresh produce overseas, because they're feeding into the UK, and these countries are like, what are they on about? Like, what are they asking us for this information for? They've got, but well, they pay the bills. We better look into it, right? So, and I think you're right. I mean, Scotland isn't going to feed the world, but we are part of a, you know, in many ways, we are actually trying to lead, and other countries are starting to notice. And we've, you know, Scottish farmers and researchers and all sorts of things have got links all over the world. You'd be surprised where Scots people turn up when there's good land to be had somewhere. So, yeah, I don't think we should. The fact we're a small rock on the end of a even smaller rock shouldn't really, in the middle of the sea, we shouldn't worry about that, because we've got, you know, you'd be amazed where the influence of what we are doing can land. Yeah,
I think that's the key, is that with climate change and with growing populations, we shouldn't look at the scale of it and kind of be disheartened or anything, or say like what can we do, or we don't have an impact. There's a huge impact through the influence that Scotland and the UK has on the world, and I think, as you said, Julian, that's key. I'm gonna try and get two more questions in. We've got another one. We've got another couple in. Well, we've got one more. I'm gonna try and combine these, and then I'm going to finish off with one final point. There was a question here about setting of targets and the benefits being quite subjective, and how do we remain consistent. And there was also a question about someone who had completed 3 carbon audits through the beef efficiency scheme and made improvements, and now kind of doesn't know where they can go from there. So I think the question is how can we like maintain a consistency throughout every farm in Scotland, that when we look to move towards different production systems, whether we call it forced or incentivized, how are we going to be able to, well, the question is, who is going to police the police?
So just to begin, and I don't want to steal your thunder, Julian, but on the issue of the carbon auditing, the person asking the question had said that they've undertaken their 3 carbon audits and they've made changes, and I would hope that they've seen improvements, but look at cracking and do a 4th carbon audit. You know, things have moved on in the last 5 years. I'm sure your business has moved on. Things will have changed that you've implemented. Things will have changed that you had nothing to do with. So yeah, let's continue building out the data set, informing your decisions and tracking your improvements, because that is the way forward for us. It's that consistency that I mentioned at the beginning, that we need to continue the process and be constantly moving.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. And obviously the landscape's shifting in terms of, you know, there are I think there's obviously continual improvement doesn't go away, but there are, depending on what happens with incentive schemes and things like that, actually the incentive to go further may actually increase. So financial incentive, which obviously then you can start looking at maybe a bit wider at different measures on the farm, that maybe if you're just trying to obviously optimize your current situation. So it's not static, and obviously the government and others know that if they want farming to move in a certain direction, it's going to have to be enough incentive, whatever shape that takes. So yeah, and those who can move a bit quicker will maybe do better, so it's another, again, an opportunity to look hard at new methods and new ways of running a business.
Good stuff. If that's all on that, what I will do is, I just seen another question came in relating to reducing emissions in animal agriculture, and we've spoken about this in our reducing emissions webinars in where we looked at how we can improve efficiencies and reduce emissions of methane going forward. So I don't want to go into that again just now because I'm conscious of time, but we'll make sure that the webinars, the past webinars, are not available online just yet, but they will be available at the very latest on Wednesday. So you'll be able to have a look back there and see what we have to say on that. So I think just to finish up then, I would just like to try and end on a somewhat kind of positive note, or maybe not positive note, but an encouraging note for the listeners. So what would your kind of what do you think the opportunities are for Scottish agriculture moving forward in terms of the future ahead of us? So climate change, these policy changes, what are the real kind of opportunities ahead? I'd like no one's getting away without giving me an answer, so I'd like an answer from each of you on this, but I won't pick one of you out. So does anyone want to volunteer?
Okay, I'll go first and get it over with Seamus. I feel very strongly each business needs to the time to look at what you're doing is now. I think you need to, well, I think the opportunities lie in looking at your asset base, so your natural capital, your landscape. Can you become more of that mixed type of farming business where you draw income streams from other areas, maybe ride the staycation boom? There's a lot of opportunities in the agritourism piece at the moment. There's also a lot of opportunities in the education piece where, and I keep coming back to this, the general public is hungry for information and connection with ecology, landscape, biodiversity. These are things that we should be doing anyway. We should be planting more hedges, planting more trees. And, you know, when was the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. When's the second best time? Now. So it's time to really look hard at your business, see what you've got, try to diversify, to try and protect yourself, but also to try to protect yourself and also your business. And you need to look at your own resources, your natural resources within your business, and also your human resources. What resources do you have? Do you want to bring the next generation into farming? And what are the ways of doing that? If the current system hasn't offered that, then maybe it's time to look at other things.
That's great, Sasha. And I think just to mention Jill in the chat, when I asked for what people are doing in terms of adaptation on their farms, Jill gave quite a good comment, and I think you've backed that up there. So who wants to go next?
I think as a whole, you know, there's an opportunity to, I've been more or less what Sasha was saying, but to trial things on the farm, to actually try things, you know, on a small scale. You can try anything, like if it fails, so what? you move on, you learn things, and in fact, you won't learn anything without things failing, will you? So, you know, I think to try and get some time and energy, I mean, this is easier said than done, but to try and get some time and energy to actually start looking at some alternatives to the way things are at the moment, whether it's the way the crops you grow, the way the breed, which has been mentioned earlier, you know, the way that you manage the system, the markets you meet, you know, have a dabble with something, you know, an acre here or there into a new mix, you know, a few animals to try out a new breed, you know, footing around to find out what the opportunity in selling to a certain market is. You know, you don't need to spend a huge amount of time on it, but it would just be good to, if you're not doing that kind of thing, to get started and because that is the most valuable time you're going to have, is to look at the future, look at opportunities. And I know it's hard, but just to try and get away from just running the business, is to have a bit of time to think about and investigate things. Because you'd be amazed if you can spend a bit of time. There's a lot of like-minded people out there looking to share ideas, as you well know, in farming and other industries. So there's a tremendous resources, and all the information that's available, you can find an incredible amount of information sort of electronically as well. So, you know, as free up some time for that would be as an opportunity, would be my say.
I want to go first before Alex comes in, because I'm pretty sure Alex's point will be a lot more succinct and a nice way to round it up than mine. But in terms of general opportunities, I think it's quite easy to look at this challenge and everything we've got to try and do and be quite overwhelmed and quite daunted by it. Whereas I actually think, from a personal point of view, I think it's a really interesting time to be involved in the industry and to be trying to do these challenges. And there's a lot of opportunities there in terms of kind of new jobs, new way of doing things, improving ecosystems, providing sustainable food, tackling climate change, all these sorts of things. I think we're up for the challenge. I think it's actually quite a good time to be involved in it. I think it's a really interesting few years we're going to see as we try and basically come to a solution for a whole list of these issues and policies and various things we've got to deal with.
Well, I've just learned a lesson, and that's that going last in the lineup puts you in serious danger of losing your good point to somebody earlier. Sasha, you came dangerously close, but I think my answer's still valid here. I think that agriculture has a tremendous role to play and a great opportunity within the climate crisis. We can be that constructive force that we want to be. But I also think that we have a biodiversity crisis as well, and we need to be able to address that. There's a lot of interplay between climate change and biodiversity decline. We all know that. But I do think that whether it's the development of a biodiversity calculator, whether it's a new round of environmental schemes for Scottish farmers and crofters, that we need to get to grips with our on-farm biodiversity, and whether that's in your soil, your water environment, the planting of more woodland and hedges. I think there's huge potential there that a lot of people are apprehensive or scared to get stuck in with. But no, that would be my closing statement.
That's great. Thanks very much. I think just over the last few weeks of having these webinars, anyway, I've certainly I would certainly be full of kind of encouragement that any challenges that come our way, we'll be well able to tackle them as an industry. So, can everyone see my slides now? You can? No?
Yep.
They're all good, sorry. So before we go tonight, again, just want to make you aware, as I'm sure you will be, COP26 is coming to Glasgow next week. We're literally at the on the eve of it kind of this week. Road closures and all have began. It's starting to go a bit mental. I'm in the city myself. But there are loads of events, loads of different things that you can attend and get to in person or virtually. the UK government green zone events. There are a few different kind of events that are focused on agriculture, but there's loads of things that you could be interested in there. I saw Formula E are actually doing a big presentation about their future and all that kind of stuff. So even outside of farming and your own business, there's loads of stuff happening there that I would encourage you to have a look at. But in terms of agriculture and food and farming, Nourish Scotland have managed to get a recipes for resilience kind of an agenda for food at COP26, and they are in-person events, and also a lot of them are online. So check them out. I think Ian has put them the 2 links to those 2 events in the chat. Another thing to just make you aware of is the Global Day of Action on the 6th of November. There's going to be quite a big protest in Glasgow. So you might be thinking, I'll go to that, or you might be thinking that'll be a day I'll avoid Glasgow, which either one is completely valid. But just in general, there is going to be loads of different things happening. I tried to find to update this list. I tried to find stuff that was relevant to tonight, and I just was inundated with stuff. So if you just Google COP26 fringe events, you'll find a phenomenal amount of stuff, and there'll definitely be something there to interest everyone. I'll try and move on. And one event you might be interested in is on actually next Monday at oh God, I'll need to confirm the time, but I think it's a 7 p.m. kickoff, and it's a live stream event that we have organised. We've got Ken Rundle presenting of Landward fame, and we're going to try and look at how research in Scotland and how our Scottish researchers have what they've done to try and help us tackle the climate change challenge. So it kind of does come back a bit to what we were talking about there, as we may not be able to feed the world, but we can definitely put everyone on the right path towards a sustainable future, and try and do our bit that way. So if you could see the number of panelists there, some of you might be aware of, but there's a really great panel there. This hasn't been advertised yet, so this is the first people hearing about it are you guys, and it should be, if you keep an eye on the Farm Advisory Service, Facebook and Twitter and all that kind of stuff, you'll get all the details of how to join. It's going to be a live stream event, and we're hoping to be on farm as well. So yeah, it should be good. It should be good. So finally then, thanks very much to everyone. It was an absolute pleasure doing this over the last 5 weeks. I really hope that people who have kind of returned and for the whole 5 webinars really got a lot out of it, and kind of feel enthused and feel like they can actually take on the challenges ahead, and it's not all doom and gloom, and that we can certainly face up to the climate challenge and all the rest that comes our way. So on that then, I will leave it there. Also just like to thank, before I go, to thank the panelists tonight, Julian, Sasha, Alex and Ian, and in particularly Ian, who's been at the back of all these webinars, making sure that nothing went wrong, and nothing did, hopefully. But thanks very much to everyone tonight, and we hope you have a good evening.